So today we move into part 2. How is the pure science of nature possible? And what does he mean by pure natural science? Essentially, physics. Okay? How is it possible for me to make judgments in natural science like one event is the cause of another event, or that a thing remains the same object throughout changes to its appearance? Okay? What Kant seeks to explain in this section is how our experience of the world is possible. Because what Kant is maintaining is that, unlike what Hume said, we do indeed experience the world immediately in terms of cause and effect. But cause and effect, unlike what Hume had argued, according to Kant, is not the only concept or principle in terms of which we understand the world. For Kant, there are 12 of them, and he calls these the concepts of the understanding. The ones we've been talking about primarily are substance and cause. But for Kant, the 12 concepts of the understanding can be divided into 4 categories: quantity, quality, relation, and modality, each of which possesses 3 concepts that belong a priori to the faculty of mind Kant calls the understanding. In part 1, by explaining how pure mathematics is possible, Kant also succeeded in demonstrating how perception is possible. Because, to go back to Hume's example, when I experience ball A roll into ball B, followed by the motion of ball B, that is a perception. It is a spatial and temporal perception. I observe that A moves through this space at a certain time or through a sequence of moments, and at the moment that it makes contact with ball B is set in motion through space and time. But what Kant showed us is that space and time are not properties belonging to these objects as things in themselves. Space and time are not out there. They're in here. Okay. And so when I perceive A followed by B, that perception is made possible by the faculty of sensibility. If my mind did not already possess a priori the forms of intuition, space and time, then there would be no perception and therefore no such thing as an object of experience at all. whatever this is in itself is completely off limits to my perception. But because whatever is given to my sensibility to format in space and time is represented by the mind to itself as an event in space and time, it is possible for me to have perceptions. I cannot have a perception of something not in space and time, because space and time make the objects of perception possible. That doesn't mean there is no thing in itself, nor does it mean there is a thing in itself. It simply means that the only way it is possible for the human mind to perceive nature is as a collection of objects represented spatially and temporally. But this does not explain that there is a necessary inner relationship between these two perceptions, such that given the first perception, the second perception must follow. This was Hume's problem. Where does the concept of cause and effect come from? Because all that is contained in the perception is the one event followed by the other event. Well, just as the perception is made possible by my a priori forms of intuition, the judgment of experience that A is the cause of B is made possible when that perception is synthesized with an a priori concept that allows me to understand A as the necessary cause of B. Just as space and time are not containers that are out there within which things in themselves reside, but rather are the lenses that make it possible for me to perceive spatial and temporal events. The concepts which are then imposed upon those perceptions in order to make possible my experience of cause and effect are also a priori structures of reason. So here's what happens. And mind you, this all goes on automatically behind the scenes. You do not will this to happen. Nor is it the case that you first perceive A followed by B and then think about it and choose which concept is necessary to make sense of that perception. We are put together to experience the world in space and time and subject to the concepts of my understanding, which we then call the laws of nature. The laws of nature are the concepts of the understanding.
Are they all considered under that synthetic a priori category?
Here's what you've got to keep in mind. Now, if we were reading the Critique of Pure Reason instead of the Prolegomena, this gets spelled out very carefully. Okay? The sensibility performs a synthesis of its own because it represents A prior to B and proximate to B in space. Okay? But then that perception is presented, as it were, to the faculty of understanding for validation by the super addition of one or more concepts, which allows me to understand the relationship between those two perceptions. When I say that I perceive the desk, and the desk is something that exists, I have employed the concept of existence. But in order for the thing to exist, it must first have been possible for it to exist. So I'm also employing the concept of possibility. Okay? Think about the category of quality. Go back to Plato. Plato said that what is ultimately real, or fully in being, is the form of the good. And everything else which exists is a reflection of that good. So there is the good, which is full being, and then its contradictory would be nothing, or negation. And then everything which lies between the forms and nothingness, or pure negation, is some degree of participation that is limited. Reality, negation, limitation. The things belonging to the visible realm which participate in the reality of the forms are not just nothing, but they are negated to a certain extent and limited in their perfection. Okay? Now to go back to your question, once the mind or the sensibility represents a perception in space and time to itself, then the understanding superimposes a concept or multiple concepts upon that perception. So the synthetic a priori judgment that is the basis of our experience is the synthesis between perceptions or percepts represented by the sensibility with a priori concepts provided by the understanding. The concepts make it possible for me to understand what is represented perceptually by the sensibility. My experience of ball A causing ball B is immediate. When I knock on the board and you hear the sound, you indeed immediately experience the knocking to be the cause of the sound, because your faculties of sensibility and understanding work together behind the scenes, like the operating system of a computer, to represent that perception as a causal relationship. We don't see the things in themselves in the same way that when you're sitting before your computer screen, you don't see the binary code. You see images. Well, that's what your mind does. It takes something we know not what, things in themselves, and translates them into an experience that is intelligible for us. And this is the only way we can experience the world, as populated by spatial temporal objects governed by the concepts of the understanding. These concepts are the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not properties of things in themselves. And here is perhaps one of the most important things for you to remember, that these concepts are valid only for objects of possible experience, which means objects represented in space and time, in a perception. Now, the judgments of my perception, for example, that A occurs followed by B, is simply a perceptual judgment and is only subjectively valid. Now, what does that mean? Well, consider this. Here is an object, a chair, that is perceived as an object in space and time, both by you and by me. But we each see it from our own perspective. Okay? Now, because space and time are a priori forms of intuition that we all share, we all see this object in space and time. But because we see it from different perspectives, that perception has only subjective validity, in the same way that if we both take a sip from the same glass of orange juice, but I had just brushed my teeth, the same thing will taste bitter to me that tastes sweet to you. Now, we both understand that the juice is the cause of the taste, but the way it actually tastes is a matter of subjectivity. Okay? Or likewise, if you and I are both observing the same moving object, and we are both in motion as well, but you're moving faster than I am moving, then the same object will appear to be moving slower to you than it appears to me. Okay? So judgments of perception are subjectively valid. But when they are then synthesized with the a priori concept, that subjectively valid judgment becomes objectively valid. And the judgment of perception becomes a judgment of experience. Perception alone is not yet experience for Kant. And here's an example of why it is urgent to understand the way that a particular thinker uses terms. Ordinarily, when we use the word experience, we think about what Kant means by perception, simply seeing something or hearing something. But for Kant, experience equals the synthesis of perceptions with a priori concepts. Which leads me to one of the most famous lines in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant says that concepts like substance, cause, community, existence, necessity, possibility, negation, limitation, concepts without percepts are empty. They have no use. But percepts without concepts are blind. The concepts are still there. They are a priori formalisms belonging to the understanding. But until they are given some perceptual content, they remain empty and have no valid application. They are perfectly suited to render the world intelligible. But likewise, a perception all by itself, without the addition of a concept, is blind. Hume, so to speak, was blind to the causal relationship between A and B, because he was still thinking about objects as things in themselves. To a certain extent. Okay, Hume does say that I cannot affirm nor deny the existence of substance because I have no perception of substance. Okay? What he didn't realize is that substance, like space and time, are structures of reason and not properties of things in themselves. Okay? So experience is possible on the basis of a synthesis of something that I see, perceptions, and something that I think, conceptions, something I perceive and something I conceive. Now notice, who was it that said that knowledge must contain a sensory perception? That all knowledge originates with sense perception. In general.
That was earlier.
The empiricists. Right? All knowledge originates in a sensory perception. A posteriori. And who was it that said that knowledge requires something a priori? the rationalists. So what Kant has done is to marry empiricism with rationalism. They both had a piece of the puzzle. But with the exception of possibly Leibniz and Berkeley, they were all still captive of the subject-object dualism. Kant has collapsed it. There is no such thing as subject-object dualism in a real sense. Yes, I talk about myself as subject and the object of my perception as separate from me. Okay, I can draw that distinction so long as you remember that there could never be anything like an object unless it is represented by our forms of intuition. So if you say to Kant, Kant, how do you know that our forms of intuition, space and time, or our concepts are the right ones to explain the world? He would say you've missed the entire point. Because my experience of the world is made possible by these concepts and the forms of my intuition. Nature is not a thing in itself. What we call nature is the experience of objects in space and time and governed by necessary universal principles, which are nothing other than the concepts of my understanding. And so, we do not observe events in space and time and then abstract the laws of nature from those perceptions. We immediately experience the world as governed by the principle of cause and effect. The laws of nature are not derived from experience, rather, they are prescribed by reason to experience. Or better yet, they make the experience possible.
How do you go about making the list?
He simply thought about the kinds of judgments that we make. I say that things exist. I say that some things are possible, but I also have a concept of necessity, like, for example, given one event, another one must necessarily follow, or the necessity that a thing be identical to itself. Okay? I think I make judgments of the sort that there is a discrete thing, a unity. I make the judgment that a group of these things is a plurality, and I make the judgment that the total sum of all things is a totality. I think in terms of what is real and what is not real. and also in terms of where the reality of one thing begins and that of another thing begins. That is the limitation of objects in space and time. I think about things like the moon as it goes through its different phases as simply being different appearances of the same object, a substance, just like Descartes' wax. That is the cause of the tides. Okay? But I can also think about all the planets and their moons and our sun as substantial objects in space and time, governed by cause and effect relationships that form a community or a systematic totality of objects governed by natural law. But we are the laws of nature, because that's the way that our experience is generated. Okay? So, really, he could have just flipped through a logic book and looked at all the different kinds of judgments that we make. Now, maybe he's got it, maybe he doesn't. Maybe there are more categories, more concepts than these. Or maybe I could reduce two or more of these to one. Okay? That's really detail work. The brilliance is in the collapse of the subject-object dualism. By showing that the laws of nature must be derived from the very same sources that make my experience possible at all. The structures of my mind are the laws of nature. It is the only way that human reason is capable of experiencing the world. So he has now demonstrated to us the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments, not only as they pertain to perceptions, but as they pertain to the experience of the world and how our judgments of experience are valid. That is, where they get their universal and necessary authority. These concepts are perfectly suited to render my experience intelligible because they make the experience possible in the first place. So again, when I experience a causal relationship, I am not looking at something that is completely separate from me. I am looking at the structure of my own consciousness.
He's saying they're not applications, they're just hardwirings.
Yes.
That make the things that...
We are hardwired with these concepts and the forms of intuition. Okay? But the content is not a priori. Okay? Just the structure, just the format. But they're valid only for objects of possible experience. Because what we will see next time is that reason loves to complete a series. So when I see that A is the cause of B, I might immediately know what the cause of A was. But then I can ask about the cause of that cause, and so on and so forth. And within the blink of an eye, my reasoning has shot way beyond what I could ever experience. And I find myself asking about the first cause. But a cause that is not the effect of some other cause could not be the object of a possible experience. And yet, reason can't help itself. It seeks the unconditioned. My experience is conditioned by these concepts. But when I attempt to think about, for example, a cause all by itself, without applying that concept to a space-time perception, he's told us that is empty. And what happens is it gives rise to what Kant calls transcendental ideas. A cause that acts outside of space and time. But we are not equipped to deal with that sort of notion. Or a substance that exists outside of space and time, like God. But what would it mean for a substance which simply means persistence throughout change to exist outside of space and time? Because there can be no such thing as change without space and time. Change requires time. And so the concept of a substance, like a mental substance, existing or persisting, but not as the object of a spatial temporal perception, generates what Kant calls pure beings of thought, transcendental ideas. And that is the topic for how metaphysics in general is possible, part 3. Okay? So far we have talked only about these two faculties of reason. The third and final one is what he calls pure reason. And pure reason is a rascal because it loves to jump ahead of itself. Okay? We'll pick that up next time.
You don't have any questions,
Yeah,
you said that well.
hold on.
You need roll?
No, I have your quizzes. No, there's no